I'm very pleased to welcome Sarah Williams to our conference. Sarah is an associate professor of technology and urban planning and director of the Civic Data Design Lab at MIT. Williams' work combines computational analysis and art design in innovative and interesting ways. And her notion of data action has received wide attention, not least since she published a book on that topic. And the core idea of data action is to use data based on communication strategies to expose urban policy issues to broad audiences and create civic engagement. And her design work has been widely exhibited, including top institutions such as Guggenheim and the Museum of Modern Art in New York. So pleased to welcome you. Thank you for being here.
I'll just start. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you so much for the conference organizers for inviting me to this conference. It's just such an amazing few days and such an incredible group of presentations that I've seen. And thank all of you for staying until the end. I really, really appreciate it. So, as it was said, my name is Sarah Williams, and my work focuses on how we can turn the narrative of data upside down. And rather than thinking of data from the perspective of those in power, why not use it to elevate the positions of those on the margins? As was mentioned, I run the Civic Data Design Lab and the Leventhal Center for Advanced Urbanism at MIT. The Leventhal Center is an interdisciplinary center that really believes creating innovation in cities takes all of the fields, whether it's architecture, computation, urban planning. I myself am very interdisciplinary. I'm trained as a geographer, an architect, an urban planner, and a data scientist. And I combine these skills to create computational strategies that affect policy change, and as was mentioned in my book, Data Action. So I thought what I would do today is talk about 3 different projects, actually projects that I have done since I published my book that really take data into action. I'm going to start with one. This is the Atlas of Popular Transport. And it's on presentation and view in Venice Biennale right now. So if you go to Venice, you can see it in the Arsenal. But in this project, I really wanted to look at the fact that in most cities in the world, the daily commute begins with a question, not a schedule. Where does the bus go? For billions who rely on popular transport or minibuses, tuk-tuks, shared vans, or repurposed school buses, the question is often a leap of faith. These systems are not mapped, but they are essential to the communities that they service. And so in the Atlas of Popular Transport, we wanted to show what happens when that changes, illustrating how 16 cities across Africa, Asia, and Latin America took advantage of a unique convergence of forces: the falling cost of smartphones, the rise of open source tools, and most importantly, the determination of local actors who believed their cities deserved better and decided to develop data and maps of how their semi-formal, informal, or popular transport systems operate to improve transport policy and provide greater access to these essential resources. So what do I mean? Why don't we start with one example? So almost 12 years ago, I came to Nairobi to develop a transportation model. And in order to make my model, obviously, I want to know traffic flows and vehicles on the roadway. So this is an average scene in Nairobi, and what you're seeing are matatus, or these informal transit systems. And can you believe it? There was no data or even a map about where these systems went. But as you can see, they represent the majority of vehicles on the roadway. So in order to create an accurate model, I needed this data. But I also realized that people living in Nairobi didn't have this essential data set. So in collaboration with the University of Nairobi's computer science department, we built an app that allowed passengers to ride on the informal transit, collecting data on the routes and stops all along the way. The data we collected was in a format called GTFS, and it's really just a structured format. You guys have probably all used GTFS. It's what we use when we search on in Google Maps. So the way that we know our public transport in Google Maps is because we are using this GTFS system. But I also wanted a way that the maps could be accessed by anyone. So we started to think about a way to visualize the system, not just for our model, but so that the people who live in this city could understand and access their data. So we developed a map very similar to one that you might see in New York, London, and then we teamed up with stakeholders in the community to edit this map. So here, what you're seeing is actually us working with the matatu drivers and owners, and they're talking about why aren't there any matatus in the north? Should we be planning them? And so by visualizing this data, it instantly became a planning tool and useful for policy action in the city. We had a hackathon with the local tech community to explain what the GTFS format was, and then over 5 apps were created from the openly available data set that we developed. Because we developed it in the GTFS standard, it was the first informal transit system to be navigable on Google Maps. Now many systems are available. And semi-formal transit provides mobility around the world, not just in Nairobi, but in the majority of cities outside the US and Europe. And many of these cities followed our lead. Maps came up from Amman to Managua. And so we created a global network of mapping transport data with resource centers in Africa and Latin America. So while the atlas that I showed you here doesn't represent every mapping effort worldwide, we tried to take a sample of 16 cities. These cities, we interviewed each one of them. Some fill policy gaps, others support grassroots organizing, others help with gender inclusion. All were shaped by those who lived and the experiences that they had. And the voices are captured through interviews that we had with each one of the cities to develop the atlas, showing how they overcame challenges to build something much more meaningful for their communities. So each one of the cities that kind of followed my lead in Nairobi were presented in the atlas, and the data was projected on screens, paper maps tucked away in drawers that when pulled out activated immersive video experiences that place you on each street. The installation invites you to feel what it's like to ride a bus, to be part of these places, and to move through these systems designed by the people who use them every day. With GPS trackers, cell phones in their hands, and deep knowledge of their streets, students, union leaders, civic activists, artists, riders mapped these popular transport systems that had gone undocumented but served millions daily. Their efforts were not part of a grand transportation overhaul or billion-dollar infrastructure projects. They were grassroots, volunteer-powered, low-tech, and wildly ambitious. From the buzzing jeepneys in Manila to the music-blasting matatus in Nairobi, the overstuffed yellow dam floors of Lagos, and Cairo's ever-present microbuses, each project represented a quiet revolution, the decision to map what already exists and the belief that making it visible can transform how a city moves. Here we see the maps as you open the drawer. And one of the things that I think is important is that each one of these cities created the data in this standardized format. So here we're looking at Cairo's data, and once the data was in the standard format, it could be used in many different applications, but also easily transformed into a map. In Cairo, this is the main subway system map currently. Just some images from the exhibition. And I think one of the things that was really great about collecting each one of the stories from the atlas is that each one of them had a different policy impact. So in Cape Town, they used the data to form an electric vehicle passage, and they're starting to develop electric vehicles for these types of transport. In Cairo, it talked about the data was collected by women in order to make the system more inclusive for women to understand the problems. In Cochabamba, they created an app that's most widely used app in the city instead of making a map. Also in Santiago de Cabrera's, the mappers actually looked at blind spots. So how to navigate the system. The data includes stops that are good for blind people as well as women. And so the atlas includes all these stories. You can see it online. But it's a manifesto in collective intelligence, the conversion of human insight, technological tools, and the imagination to create data against all limitations. It shows that knowledge to transform our cities already exists in the hands of those who move through them. It reminds us that the smartest cities are not necessarily the ones with the most sensors. They're the ones built through the hands of the collective vision of its inhabitants. So I'm going to move on to another project. In the last few years, our research team has been interested in issues around migration. Here we're looking at a visualization our team created with data collected from migrants on the passage between Colombia and Panama, showing they represented 42 different countries as far away as China and West Africa. And we got this data by adding hotspots along the migration routes where they entered our surveys. But our team wanted to know what motivated these migrants to flee. And so together with the World Food Program, the Migration Policy Institute, and the Inter-American Development Bank, and Organization of American States, we interviewed 5,000 migrants about their motivations, how much money they spend on migration, their debt, how the remittances they receive affect their daily life. The data sample was taken from regions in each of these countries that were experiencing high levels of migration due to climate, violence, and economic. We chose our sample by looking at where Central American migrants were being deported back from the US border. Together, our team crunched the data and produced a report. Yet we felt that traditional representation of the report was not helping us get the message across to policymakers, especially with the number of reports I could see lying around on my colleagues' floor. There was just stacks and stacks of these reports. And we asked them, could we try something different for a US congressional hearing around migration? And my colleagues took a leap of faith, and we created a tool that everyone could interact with. At this time, congressional hearings were still happening on Zoom, and we walked the congressman through the website, contextualizing the work in the larger historical framework, showing that food security, violence, and climate variability are factors for why people flee. One of the biggest insights from our report was the sheer cost of migration. Can you believe that migrants from Central America in just 1 year spent $2.2 billion to migrate to the US, while we spend, or the US spends, $2.9 billion to keep those same migrants out? Migrants collectively spend close to the same amount of money their governments spend on primary education. We illustrated that migrants take on significant risks, including long-term debt, while the United States depends on those migrants for our labor force. Just to give you an example, the US agriculture labor force is 73% migrants, and 95% of those migrants are Mexican. Here, our team was recommending that the US provide more agricultural visas for Central American migrants, where we found that the money they earn and send back home would go to sustaining life, acting as a social welfare where no one else was helping out. And that is exactly the recommendation that 33 senators made to the Department of Homeland Security just 2 months after our presentation, citing our study in their letter. Ultimately, in June of 2022, Biden announced a bill creating more legal pathways for Central American migrants to help address the labor force issue, and the results reduce risk and increase the benefits migrants can have on society. Of course, all of this has been reversed in Trump, but we made that effort at this time. But one of the things that I wanted to note is after the presentation to Congress, we interviewed people who attended the meeting, and we asked how the data visualizations might have affected their letter. And they said one of the reasons that the message got across is because they felt like they had control over the analysis, that they could find their own insights in the data, and it made the data something that they could trust and believe in. Now, of course, I'm presenting that data to them through kind of my visual interpretation, but the interactive learning that was involved with this data visualization really helped build trust in the information that was coming to them. So rather than being presented with a charted graph, they could find their own insights. So after the congressional hearing, we wanted migrants to have a way to tell their story with the data, to participate in the data making, and taking inspiration from this visualization, we made a tapestry that represented the motivations of migrants. And that tapestry illustrated the $2.2 billion they collectively spent to migrate. So what we did is, when Venezuelan currency was devalued, people started to weave objects out of money. And we used that same money weaving technique to build a tapestry or a tapestry data visualization. We designed each piece of money from data in our report. So this bill illustrates that in Guatemala, 95% of remittances go to sustaining life, and 15% of the GDP comes from remittances that migrants send home. The colors of the bills represented different motivations to leave, green being climate, yellow for better quality of life, red for family reunification, blue for economics, and purple for security. The tapestry and money and interactive data visualizations were presented to UN ambassadors at the World Food Program Executive Board meeting in Rome. So in Rome, all of the UN is funded by all of the nation states. They come, ambassadors from all the countries come, and they think about where are they going to apply funding and resources for the World Food Program. And what happened through this exhibition is really a shared learning. It inspired unexpected conversations between the Venezuelan and Panamanian ambassadors about the root causes of migration, dialogues that have been stifled in these formal sessions. So one of the things that I'm really trying to say is that art brings out kinds of civic debate, and using data art can help bring those conversations to a new level where they're often stuck inside closed doors. Each piece of money represented one migrant's motivation and had a sensor chip placed in it inside that, when tapped on the wall, explained their motivation to migrate. I'm going to move to the next project, but I just want to emphasize that the results of this tapestry not only helped bring the migrant condition to the ambassadors at the World Food Program, but actually helped garner a lot of resources and funds for the World Food Program, where a lot of aid was going to Ukraine or Afghanistan. It helped reposition the interests and needs of migrants. Okay, so I'm going to move on to my last example. So this project, we're moving to China, and we looked at the issue of ghost cities. So if you don't know what ghost cities are, they are vacant residential developments or small neighborhoods in existing communities that lie vacant. And data about where these developments are does not exist. And the issue of ghost cities is very controversial to local politics, but really shows the amount of risk in the Chinese real estate market. So we thought, how could we identify ghost cities? And we thought a thriving community needs restaurants, it needs schools, it needs a place to get your hair cut. And could we scrape data from Chinese social media sites about where amenities are? And if you don't have amenities near you, could you potentially be a ghost city? So we scraped data from Dianping, and then we scraped data from AMAP and Baidu, looking at residential locations. And then we created a 300 meter by 300 meter grid covering each residential location. And then we took the centroid of the residential location and mapped how close what was the closest amenity to that location. We took in account whether or not an amenity had a review or not. So if you had no reviews, most likely it's not some place that people went to, and so we didn't include it within the score. The amenity score is based on Hansen's gravitational model that measures urban accessibility. And we calculated the score for all of those residential cells. And we use this score because it takes into account that if we live farther from a city, we're willing to travel further to get to an amenity, right? So I would travel 20 minutes if I'm living in a suburb versus if I'm living in the city, I would want to be much closer. Then we perform spatial autocorrelation on the cells that remain, saying that clustered cells are most likely a ghost city. And then we ground truthed our data, in 3 cities, in Chengdu, Tianjin, and Xi'an. And so just to look at the ghost cities that we found in Xi'an, as an example, we found places that look like this. So this is a residential development that had been built 5 years prior. And what the government would argue is that the economics of building this place, the jobs that it created, the development processes, those economic values outweigh the fact that perhaps that this a residential location is not occupied or fully inhabited. We also found locations like this one, which is stalled developments next to residential locations that were built. And in many areas where China is developing these buildings, they will build the building for whoever was living there before, and then wait for the building to be populated. So in this case, the residences were mostly populated by people who lived in that village prior to that time. And then we found places like this, whole cities. This is actually an old communist housing block that was getting ready to be torn down. So we found really something that's older, not a new ghost city, but maybe an older ghost city here. And then we found whole cities that lie vacant. So you see them here. And this was meant to be the science center. And there's a lot of reasons that these larger cities get developed, but nobody moves in. One of the biggest of which is they don't move the jobs or even schools to these locations. But I wanted a way to explain our model to people living in China, to ask them to verify whether my work made sense, right? So how do I communicate this model to somebody who might not understand Hansen's gravitational model, I might want to ask whether my results are valid. And so we created this data visualization of the 10 cities. And when you click on each one of the cells, you are able to identify what went into the model itself or what created it. And I'm just going to play this again because if you look, if you look at one of these cells, you can see that this one is not a ghost city because it's very close to a grocery store, malls, and other areas. But as you go to the outskirts, to this particular red cell, you can see it's not close to a mall or school or a medical location. So this is what's causing it to be a ghost city within our Hansen's model. And then I talked to people in China. Here we're talking to a senior urban planner at the Chinese Academy of Urban Planning, and she said, these vacant developments are very controversial to local politics because local urban planners know that they shouldn't be developed there or that they won't be sustained, but they have little control or little ability to influence the decisions that are coming from the top. And they talk about how the decisions are being made mostly on theory without really data to back up the locations in which these developments are happening. We talked to a real estate developer, and I think he was probably the most interesting person that we talked to, and he discussed how this burst of the real estate bubble would carry irreversible impacts on residents who buy houses with mortgages. And one of the things that he told us was going on is that, it's very common in China for people to own 3-4 homes. And this was a way to invest your money before the Chinese stock market. So this idea of having a home that you don't rent out, but you also don't live in is very common. But the government is continuing to encourage people to buy more and more homes and starting to encourage them to buy homes with mortgages. And so the kind of expanding that market was going to have really irreversible impacts. And so part of what was happening with the ghost city phenomenon is that actually developments couldn't pay their money back to the bank because they weren't selling everything. But the bank and the government are the same thing. So the government would open up new land to and give them a loan for that new land, and they would use that loan to pay back the previous development. So it became a bit of a Ponzi scheme, and this is what we've heard with Evergrande and some of the developments that you've already probably heard about more recently. And so really the mismatch between supply and demand geospatially became a big problem. And we talked to academics that addressing this oversupply will really be looming ahead. So ultimately, what we created here is a map of risk in the Chinese real estate market. And this risk, we produced these maps before the Evergrande scandal, and much of our data was validated from that process. We also exhibited this work and allowed people to click on and interact with the data. They could pick this cell and then also look at drone footage of where we ground source that information. So one of the things that I think is really important is not just doing data analytics, but also working very closely with the people that the data represents. So here we worked very closely with the Chinese planners, real estate developers to validate our work, but also in the case of the migrants, validating our data visualizations and then having them co-develop and co-build the policy analysis, and the same with the Atlas. We are currently launching 2 new projects, People-Powered AI and Benchmark, but I encourage you to look at many of the different projects in the Civic Data Design Lab where we try to take data and computation and really create change in government. Thank you so much. I really appreciated your time.
Thank you, Sarah. Truly fascinating keynote. I'm really happy we placed you in the end. This worked out very well. Thank you. We have time for questions. Don't be shy. Here.
Hi, thanks, Sarah. This was really fascinating, but also I was really overwhelmed by can you tell us a little bit behind the scenes? How are these kind of projects set up? What kind of team did you have?
Yeah, so I think all of the projects I have a data scientist, a designer, and a policy expert. That's the core of the team that I think is really important, because I think that, as data scientists, like, we can understand the computational aspects of things, but we might not know the relevance or the policy questions. And so one of the things that's really a strength about all my projects is that close relationship with policy analysts about how to ask the right questions. Because if we ask the right questions, we really can put them on the policy agenda. And then we always have a designer working with us to help us communicate our results clearly.
All right, yeah. Thank you very much for a super nice presentation. This type of work seems like it requires an immense amount of time and an immense amount of resources, which I guess are not really super aligned with, like, sort of, let's say, the usual academic line of work, where you have incentives to work in a shorter time scale than this way. What are sort of your thoughts on, as a young researcher, should you just pave ahead and try and do this thing, even though it's like a high risk, high reward kind of strategy, or is it for later part of your career, or what are your thoughts on this?
Well, first I would say they don't take that much money, like, to do. Like, how much money do you think the Ghost Cities one cost? Just guess.
I have absolutely no idea, but I guess traveling around, also having to spend the time really double checking. I don't know. What is that? Tens of thousands of dollars, or are we just thousands of dollars, or?
No, that costs about $100,000. So I don't think about it like in the money. Well, okay. Now we're stuck on thinking on time, now we're stuck on thinking about the money. Maybe what your question is more, how do we get started as young researchers? Let me go back to that.
Maybe that's a decent way to say it. Well, it seems like it's not super aligned with the incentives that I see around, if that makes sense.
Meaning what incentives? Like, what do you mean?
Let's say incentives to be like, oh yeah, publish a lot and get a lot of citation. That will make it easier to get the next step when you're done with the first postdoc and so forth and so forth. This kind of thing. I think at least I very rarely hear people saying, "Oh, if you've managed to influence policymakers, it will make it easier to sort of progress in your career."
I see what you mean. So like taking that extra time to then make it like do the work. That's what you mean. Sorry, trying to understand. Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm a urban planner, so that what we want to do is affect policy. So maybe that was why it was hard for me to understand your question. But I think that I would say the benefit of doing this is making sure that your resource has influence beyond what your computational analysis would do. And so for me, it was like a natural next step to make those connections. But that's a choice that you can make in your career if you want to stop at the computation and then think about how to get a policy analyst to look at it. But I think it's about how you are defining what your work is, right? So here I define my work as being not just ending at the computation, but really placing it in the policy hands. And so when I talk about what is my body of work or what is my body of knowledge, it involves that next step. And I think that is valued within academia. But also they value the computation. So it's up to you how you want to define your career.
Thank you.
I think also, one thing, if you're, feeling overwhelmed by the idea of connecting it with a policy or how to do that, one of the things that my lab does is really help make those relationships between policy analysts and people who are doing computation. And sometimes we pair designers up with somebody who has done a computational analysis, and they take and then do the next step, right? So you finish your computational work, they look at your analysis and results, and then they think about how to communicate it to the policy analyst. So that's another way to do it without having to be the designer itself. And so one of the things that I've been doing a lot more and more is bringing designers and computational scientists together to help bring these kinds of conversations.
I'll go quickly. Beautiful talk. Thank you. I'm over here.
I'm like, where is that guy?
Hi, voice in the sky. I'm curious, it's similar almost to journalistic work, right? You're showing inadequacies in public services and how governments spend and use their money. I'm curious, have you faced pushback from governments or local authorities and how to deal with that and continue your work?
Yeah, I would say one of the things that we do in all of our project is really try to invite local governments or people from opposing viewpoints into the conversations very early on so that they trust our analysis, trust our results, and feel part of the process. So I think in the case of the Atlas of Popular Transport, many of those cities, the government really should be creating those data sets, but they're not doing it for lots of political reasons. They don't want to be responsible for those buses. They don't want to send the message that this is a formal transit system. But the process that we did in Nairobi, but then also encouraged each one of the other cities to do is invite all of those opposing viewpoints all along the way. And what happens is then it becomes a trusted data set that the city and the drivers and owners trust. And so, in the case of Cairo, it's become the official map. In the case of Amman, it's become the official map because of that process of co-building the analysis with the stakeholders. That's also why in the case in China, we really wanted to be able to have them look at our data set, understand it very clearly, and give us edits about what we might misunderstand from that data set and help us edit it to make it and improve upon it. So that building in that process to have oppositional views as you're doing the computational analysis is something that I think is important.
So something over here. Hello.
Yeah, sorry.
So something really interesting that you're doing here is you're taking data and aggregated stories, and you're telling these really personal, disaggregated experiences, mapping them, developing art pieces around them. And to some extent, this sounds a lot like what people in anthropology do in telling these individual stories from more broader theories. And so I wonder if you have thought about partnering with like anthropologists or other social scientists to maybe do ethnographies in the places where you're generating these data sets and telling these stories.
Yeah, I think that we do partner with lots of different diverse groups. We haven't partnered with anthropologists yet, but I mean, I'm sure we would love to. But let's take the migration project. There were a lot of different organizations that we worked with. The migrants who built the tapestry were in a shelter outside of Mexico City. So they had gotten stuck there. They were Central American migrants. And in that shelter we worked with, we took in all of their stories, which I didn't have time to show you here, but very emotional and very much a kind of qualitative aspect of this data. And so one of the things that we've been thinking a lot about is those stories, those qualitative stories have such an impact as well as adding to the quantitative analysis that we did. So how can we make a better connection between the two of them? But yes, we would love to. And I think the Atlas of Popular Transport is meant to be those stories as well.
Thanks so much. Following up on a lot of great questions that were already asked, I was wondering how your work and approach and philosophy relates to the concept of data feminism, which is a book that's also, I think, published in MIT Press. And there, the concept of kind of collaboration as opposed to like, you would say kind of like a white saviorism of like data for good and making sure that a community is empowered even when the experts leave?
Catherine De Ignacio, who wrote Data Feminism, is my student, so it makes sense that there's a lot of similarities between our work. And I think that, like she framed it under data feminism, but I think many things in data action have the same idea, that co-building data, co-building the conversations that you make with data sets are extremely important. That's one of the main reasons we wanted to create the tapestry, is really like have the ability to migrants to tell their story with the data instead of that data continuing to be something that others them, but rather like by having them build those tapestry with us, kind of putting them at the center of the conversation, or try to anyways. And that's why also the atlas is the same. So it's a very similar theory, but mine is called data action. I think that, one of the things, the reasons I wrote Data for Action is I think that, as computational scientists, we really want to help the world. We want to use data to improve policy analysts, but we often, let's say, are not always considering the effect that data might have on people. And so one of the things that I talk about is how important it is for us to validate the results with the communities that we represent. So if we are going to talk about the Matatu community or the transit community, let's validate and make sure that they are part of that process. And the same goes for the other projects that you saw.
Yeah, just a quick question. How do you identify the problems that you want to work and the countries?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So in the case of Nairobi, I've been working on a transportation model, and actually I've been working in Nairobi for 25 years. So there's lots of other Nairobi data projects. So that was a commitment to place. But when we did the project in Nairobi, cities from all over the world started contacting us, wanting us help. And so we started to talk to them. But I do want to take this moment to highlight that all the cities that came to us, we didn't help all of them because in some cases we found out that making the data visible would do more harm than good. So, these informal transit systems provide mobility where nobody else is. They're the only way people can get around in cities. But in some places, if we would visualize them, the police would crack down, remove these systems from the road, and it would remove this essential resource to those communities. And so in those places, we did not work. So one thing I always talk about in all of the data projects that I work on is to think about whether or not you will do more harm than good in producing your analysis or your visualization, who could be harmed by the results of your analysis. But with migration, it's a story that I've been wanting to tell. And in fact, this project was so successful for the World Food Program. We've now worked on almost 5 different migration-related projects for them. Migration is just something that I think is a very contemporary issue, hard to understand, very complex. So just a passion. The ghost cities in China came from somebody coming to me and asking, challenging me to see if we could do something. And so they come in different ways and formats. But again, thinking about whether I take a project is whether I will do more harm than good, which is a part of the data feminism practice, but also something that's important to data action as well.
Thank you again for your inspirational contribution, Sarah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.